we've got David Cook today. Now, he'll be well known to many people from a lot of radio appearances on things like The Moral Maze and Thought for the Day. And it's a real privilege to have David back with us. He's taught at one of our previous courses, which was really very enjoyable for us listening. I hope enjoyable for you speaking, was it? Maybe it was, because you come back, so that's good. He's a Brit, aren't you, by origin? But at the moment is splitting his job between Wheaton College in the States and Oxford, where he's a fellow at Green College, which is actually twinned with St Edmund's College here. So he lives a transatlantic life and must give interesting views on the things you're researching, because there certainly are a range of views on ethics on the two sides of the Atlantic. I think most recently David's been working on issues to do with medical ethics and sexual ethics. He's finished one book and is just in the middle of doing another one called The Moral Maze or something like that.
Through the
Moral Maze, yes. Which is dealing with those really complicated issues surrounding fertility and genetics and sexuality and ethics. Difficult because they evoke such emotional responses, but also the science moves so fast, and it is a genuinely difficult area to get to grips with. But today, David's going to talk to us about the topic, does religion block scientific advance? That's certainly a popular view amongst quite a lot of the secular population, I guess. So I think it'll be really interesting to hear David's views on it today. So thank you.
Thank you. You see, the definition of an expert is somebody who comes from somewhere else and shows slides. So on that basis, you have half an expert here today. I certainly have come from somewhere else, the other place, and I'm not going to show any slides. I was recently at a dinner and made conversation with the person sitting beside me and asked her where she worked, and she became very coy. And I said, I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to embarrass you. She said, no, we've been told not to say where we work because we work with animals and we're concerned about animal rights. And of course, you'll know in Oxford there's a tremendous drive against those who do work with animals, and indeed, sadly, people have had nail bombs delivered to their home on the part of Animal Liberation Front. And it strikes me that that's part of a context in which the public perception of science begins to filter through, and all kinds of individuals, all kinds of groups with all kinds of agenda begin to affect the practice of science and how obvious and public it actually is. I think there is a difference between the kinds of conversations we have here at the Faraday Institute and the kind of people who come and speak. What I would say really are philosophers of science over and against the bench scientists. Bench scientists, I find, certainly in the medical sciences area, are not greatly interested in questions of ultimate purpose and being and nature and meaning. They're interested in how can they do their job better, or is it going to work, or even more crucial, will we get our funding again to keep the grant going? That's the really important kind of question. So there is a gap within science itself, and it's interesting the difference between those who are reflecting on the kinds of ultimate questions that fortunately Faraday and others are dealing with over and against the practicing science. And that creates a problem in what is the practice of science and what is the public perception of science. As the chairman said, part of the problem in our popular culture is that there are certain kinds of names which dominate the scene. Even today, we could say, what's the one name that's dominated the day thus far? And I wouldn't need to repeat it. That's right, Carl, of course. Richard Dawkins. When Daniel Dennett produced his last book, I debated him in Chicago on radio, and for 3 hours we spent in the debate. The first two we debated each other with the chairman, who started off on Dennett's side and then by the end was on my side. So it was a very interesting shift during the program. But then for the last hour it was people calling in. And again, it was interesting the kinds of people who called in and the kinds of questions. They began by emphasizing the way that they thought science had disproved religion, science was antagonistic towards religion. But as time went on, that became less and less the case and became more and more open and more almost anti-science. The conclusion of the debate with Dennett was interesting because we both agreed. We agreed that religion should be taught in schools. I did because I thought it was true, and he did because he thought it was a useful meme. And therefore one way of developing morality in society, and he wanted to do an experiment by teaching it for a year to see whether it made any difference to public opinion. Public opinion and popular science does tend to think that religion blocks scientific advance. And I think if you look at where do the roots of that come from, sadly it goes back to the school. All of the countries represented here will know how important primary schools, grade schools, and then of course into the high school, and the way in which science is taught, the way in which science is picked up, often by osmosis. And the teaching of science can set a particular kind of tone. And that's why I believe that education, and education particularly in the school context, is something that we ought to be more engaged in. I'm on what's loosely known as the conference circuit at the moment, and I did a series of conferences for the Christian education movement in 7 schools in the Northwest, day conferences on medical ethics. The students all came along thinking this would be absolutely boring. They thought there was no relevance at all, nothing to do with them, and one day when they were old and grey they would think about medical ethics. And after we'd looked at fertility and contraception and genetics, then they began to change their mind. And by the end, they had a much more positive view of what medical science was actually doing and some of the kinds of issues, moral questions that needed to be raised. Schools, why should I spend my time talking to 16, 17, 18-year-olds? Because they are the people who will be the students tomorrow. They'll be the people who will then go on into all kinds of careers, and they carry a particular influence in relation to our understanding of popular science, the public perception of popular science. I have never attended a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, but I'm told that what you do is you say, I'm David Cook and I'm an alcoholic, and that's how you introduce yourself. Well, I'm David Cook and I believe that all truth is God's truth. So that's my premise, that's my assumption, that's my presupposition, that's where I'm coming from. And for many years, as someone who's been trained in philosophy and in medical ethics, I've believed that there is nothing to fear from the search for truth. That actually it's part of our Christian stewardship, our Christian responsibility. But I think regardless of what particular religious faith you hold, or no religious faith, there is nothing to fear from the search for truth. From a Christian perspective, as from most other religions, if we believe that God is at the center of our understanding and the center of the world, the center of creation, then we've nothing to fear from anything which seeks truth about the world he has created, about himself and about the people who inhabit that kind of world. I want to suggest that there was no real conflict in early science and religion. But if you examine the motivation for much of the work done really from the monastic period through until the early modern period, it's surprising how many people were influenced by their Christianity, were motivated by their Christianity. People like Francis Bacon, who wanted to understand nature. In fact, he wanted to understand it so much he wanted to torture nature so it would reveal its secrets to him. People like Newton, who again was driven by a religious impulse. It's interesting, you're going this afternoon to do the tour of Cambridge, the History of Science tour. And if you come to Oxford, I'll take you on my tour of the Oxford scene. At one point that we'll stop just outside university is where Boyle's Law. Now, when I was a student in high school, we all had to learn Boyle's Law. It's about the only thing I remember about science, and not very well. But Boyle, again, had motivation from his interest in Christianity. And of course, the name Faraday is not lightly chosen, but was chosen because, again, of that religious motivation. But not just motivation, a kind of enthusiasm. Patrick, in his address, talked about the charismatic preachers. And nowadays we think of preachers as being charismatic, usually with a small c rather than a large c. But actually scientists were very much the charismatic figures, and gathered around them groups of students, groups of people who wanted to learn and do the science. Perhaps that's a kind of model that we still have today with labs and those who head up labs. There's an enthusiasm which comes from the scientist himself or herself driving to understand the world or understand some particular thing. I spent much time working with geneticists, and interestingly, when you work with geneticists, you find that the early geneticists who really got the whole thing going were motivated by children's disease. They were confronted with children who had usually a highly debilitating disease, and then they noticed that these children, their parents had had this disease, and the grandparents had had this disease, and so they saw that there was some kind of genetic link. And even though the numbers of patients they were actually dealing with was very, very small, they were highly enthusiastic to find some way of alleviating that kind of distress, that kind of pain. There's an enthusiasm which scientists have for their work, which is why you never really want to ask, what do you do? Because they're liable to tell you. I don't think there was a conflict in early science in terms of beliefs and practice. And I want to explore that in a little way. First of all, in terms of rationality. We take rationality so much for granted. We like to make sense of things. Now, in Wheaton, in teaching undergraduates, mostly there, though it's mostly graduates in Oxford, but teaching undergraduates, you ask them, what does UNESCO mean? Now, this is an opportunity for audience participation, so you have to make the most of it. If I wrote up on the board, don't all speak at once, it's very rude. UNESCO. United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. Now this is for the Brits in our midst. TUC. Trade Union Congress, that's right. Now what happens is that we think that this makes sense. We think that this makes sense, and then I said TYBN. What does that mean? Well, actually, it doesn't mean anything at all. I just made it up. Now, what happens, though, is that you try to make sense of that in the way that you were able to make sense of the other things. So in order for science, in order for understanding, science literally means to scientia, knowledge, to happen, two things have to be the case. First of all, things need to make sense. They need to be rational. But also, we need the capacity to make sense of what makes sense. There is an inherent intelligibility in the nature of things, an inherent intelligence in the nature of people. The one has to match with the other, so much so that we still try to make sense, even if something doesn't actually make sense. Rationality and inherent intelligibility are fundamental. Christians in the early science were looking at the book of nature. They believed that the book of nature would reveal something about the nature of God. We heard yesterday in some of the lectures about the heavens declaring the glory of God. So people believed that by reading from the book of nature, we would understand better what God was like, what God is doing, what God has done. It was part of God's revealed order. It was part of God's revelation, a God who reveals himself, shows his nature in dealing with humankind, in human history, as Rodney referred to yesterday, but also in terms of the world itself. And part of that really was something which the Orthodox Church has emphasized, and perhaps we've lost a little of in the Western world, an emphasis much more on what's called doxology, praising God, giving God glory. They saw their science as part of their religion. Laborare est orare, to work is to pray. To do the scientific work was a form of prayer. There was no gap. There was no dualism between the religious life and the secular scientific understanding. They were really one, and that was a way of giving praise to God. But of course conflict came. And it's interesting just looking through the wealth of books and the wealth of material, some of it from Faraday, but also from lots of other publishers. When you go through the material, you'll find time and again this model of conflict between religion and science. Indeed, the question I was given was a question which almost assumes, does religion block scientific advance? Now, sadly, we're not all Latin scholars, and if we were Latin scholars, we would know that there are two kinds of questions you ask. If you ask the question beginning non-A, does religion block scientific advance? Of course, the answer we expect is yes. Alternatively, if I said num, does religion block scientific advance, I would expect the answer no. And the way that we frame the question can indicate certain kinds of beliefs, certain kinds of presuppositions. Conflict came, and I just want to pick up two particular names which are the two which have been referred to, but I think in the history of science and the development of science seem to have been crucial. One, of course, is Galileo. I remember as a student in Edinburgh, I went to a real university, not Oxford or Cambridge, but in Edinburgh, sitting in the Lyceum Theatre and seeing Tom Fleming, who later became a broadcaster, act out the role of Galileo. And it was very powerfully done, that presentation, a Brecht play, of the struggle between religion and science, study between a man who wanted to affirm certain scientific truth, but was hidebound by religion and the refusal on the part of some religious people, not all, because of course much of the drive had actually come from religion itself. But there was some kind of conflict which made people view this as there's a religious way of looking at the world. Perhaps it would have been fairer to say there's an Aristotelian way of looking at the world, over and against here is a modern scientific Galilean, Newtonian kind of Copernican understanding of the world. Conflict came about, and of course with Darwin we see that. On my historical tour of Oxford, we will go of course to the University Museum, where the great debate happened with Bishop Wilberforce, and there's a part of the museum where you can go, and this was literally part of where the debate took place. It was a great conflict, and if you read the magazines of the day, one of the joys in being in an Oxford or a Cambridge college is that they always have newspapers and magazines, and you can sit and read things you'd never buy yourself, but it's a Scotsman's delight. And so the magazines of the day recorded the kind of discussion, the kind of debate, and the kind of one-liners which Bishop Wilberforce managed to produce in a way which convinced the crowd. Sadly, it didn't convince history, and we saw, I think, a loss of confidence on the part of religious people. It was a conflict kind of model. And that loss of confidence, I think, has been interesting because it has created a kind of ghetto mentality. Now, that kind of ghetto mentality and the retreat into the ghetto does two kinds of things. First of all, it means that you just talk to yourselves. One of the frightening things about religions, and Dennis in one of his asides mentioned the difference between a golf club and a church. And it was a throwaway, but so often it's a throwaway which has a great deal of thinking behind it. Because for many people, it's just a kind of club, a club where you go with like-minded people who are interested what your par is and what the 17th hole is like and whether you're putting well and so on. It's a ghetto, and you find like-minded people, and so you can use shorthand. I had a friend who was doing a mission in a church in the centre of Liverpool. Now, Liverpool has been, it's not so much now, but was very run down in the city centre. And people who lived were usually poorer people because they couldn't afford to live in the suburbs and travel into work. So they tended to live bang in the centre. And one young man who was a rough diamond, had a very bad history, had been in trouble with the police, all kinds of difficulty. He was gloriously converted. And he was so new to Christianity, he did not know that you do not sit in the front row. He went to church and he sat in the very front row. That's how unfamiliar he was with how to behave properly in a church. And everybody else, of course, was sitting at the back. And my friend was preaching, and he preached, and the young man got very carried away, enthusiastic. In fact, he leapt to his feet and said, "That's bloody marvellous!" At which point the congregation explained to him that this was not language you used in church, and you didn't express your enthusiasm for religion in quite that kind of way. So please, would he tone down the language and his level of response? The difficulty is, in the ghetto, we forget that we pick up practices, we pick up language, which are almost incomprehensible to people. I was making a broadcast about artificial insemination, and it was a BBC piece, and we did about 4, 5, 6 minutes. And afterwards, it's usually the letters you get complaining about what you did or didn't say. And I had a letter from a lady, a Christian lady, who complained that in my interview with the BBC on the subject of artificial insemination, I did not mention the blood of the lamb. I wasn't quite sure how to mention the blood of the lamb in the context of artificial insemination. So I did write back and say that if she could explain to me how to do that in a natural way, the next time I was interviewed, I promised that I would mention the blood of the lamb. Now, the phrase "the blood in the lamb" means a great deal to people who come from one particular religious tradition. But for people outside the tradition, it's almost meaningless. In fact, it's downright misleading. And so the trouble with being in the ghetto is, in terms of practice, in terms of language, in terms of communication, we talk to each other, and we talk to each other in a shorthand, which is very difficult for those outside to understand, and even harder for them to interpenetrate that world. The other trouble with the ghetto is, of course, we terrify people outside the ghetto. I worked with the Black Panthers in America back in the late 60s. For a Scotsman from Hawick in the Borders, the centre of the universe, it's very difficult to understand how it would be possible for somebody like myself, a philosopher halfway through his university career, suddenly to be transported into San Francisco and Berkeley and working with the Black Panther movement. But that was what happened. And of course, part of the problem was you had to go into where the black community lived, which was the ghetto. And everybody was terrified to go into the ghetto. And everybody who knew me said, "Oh, you mustn't go there because they'll kill you." And so there was a fear on the part of those outside the ghetto about how the ghetto behaved, how the ghetto ran, and what was happening. There's a gross misunderstanding if we retreat into a ghetto from those who are outside. And so often when we're talking about religion and science, there is a motif, there is a kind of picture, there is an understanding, and it's a battle conflict kind of picture. And so initially when the religious person and the scientific person meet, we assume that the sparks will fly. I know I've been invited to a number of dinner parties in Oxford where they expect you to perform, and they bring along their pet heathen. That's usually the way they refer to them when they invite you. "I've got this pet heathen and I want you to come and convert him or her." That kind of talk. It's a battle motif. For Bacon and for many of the scientists who really helped the development and growth of science, and I think for the thinking, reflective scientists today, so often religion and science are actually two books. The book of nature and the book of scripture. They don't see these as books which are in conflict with each other. They see them rather as complementary. It was interesting, again this morning from Dennis, how he talked about complementarity. And I was reminded very much of the way in which in Kiel, Donald Mackay used to talk about things which were compatible, things which were complementary. Here were different kinds of descriptions which helped us understand the totality of reality. Science, religion, two different books. But both science and religion have certain presuppositions. I want to emphasize this very strongly because I think that people like Dawkins, people like Dennett, often make it sound as if religious people beg the question, but scientific people never beg the question. But so often when we are approaching any area of study, whether it's science, whether it's religion, a particular science, a particular religion, we have to understand that all of us have some kind of presuppositions. All of us have some kinds of assumptions. I've been working with a graduate student and trying to teach him how to think better. I hope by the time they're graduates they can think, but I'm convinced that all of us can think better. And one of the things he's found very difficult is how to exercise any kind of critical reflection. How he's managed to get this far without critical reflection, I'm not quite sure, but he maintains he's managed this. And his academic record shows this. How do we teach people how to critique? Well, one way is by asking them to look very carefully at what is being assumed. What are the assumptions? What are being taken for granted? What is being presupposed? Because we talked yesterday about Karl Barth. Now, you do not understand Karl Barth unless you understand the kind of theological education that he had. Now, the kind of theological education he had led to the Kaiser. When the Kaiser declared war, then the leading theologians of the day, the people who had taught Barth, all wrote a letter in support of German imperialism. So when Barth writes his epistle to the Romans in 1916, and then begins that kind of reversal, he does that as a reaction against. And so often, if we want to understand why someone is saying what they're saying, we need to ask, what's being assumed? What are they reacting against? You will not understand Russell, Bertrand Russell, and his whole move for his theory of descriptions and his view of logic, unless you understand he's reacting against philosophical idealism, Bradley and Bosanquet, and he's reacting against that kind of idealism, and so he turns to empiricism as an extreme kind of reaction. What is being assumed? What's being assumed positively, and what's being assumed negatively? And religion makes certain kinds of assumptions, certain kinds of presuppositions, but so does science. Science requires certain key kinds of presuppositions. One of the interesting things about being in a conference setting is not just that you meet interesting people, but that you overhear other kinds of conversations. Of course, you only hear a little bit of the conversation, and so you're liable to take the text out of the context and use it as a pretext. And so I'm going to use a conversation which I overheard just part of today and probably take it out of its context, and I apologize therefore to the participants if I misheard or misunderstood. They were referring to one of the people who taught me systematics. There's a man called T.F. Torrance. T.F. Torrance was, of course, a pupil of Karl Barth. Karl Barth, was not just based in Germany. He would come over to Scotland, to Edinburgh, and he taught there and studied there. And he was a great debater. He always won the debates. And there's a man called John Bailey, who was a very gentle, lovely man, who was at that time the principal. And he would always debate Barth and always lost. And one day, Bailey got Barth in a corner, and there was no way out. And Bailey was going to win the argument. And so he couldn't resist that kind of little extra drive. Right, Carl, what do you have to say to that? At which point Barth said, the ultimate theological argument. Barth was taught by, Barth taught Torrance. And Torrance was greatly influenced by Barth, though to be fair to Torrance, he later wanted to disassociate Barth's view of natural theology, which we heard yesterday, and apologetics from his own work, because he believed that a proper understanding of science was crucial, and part of that was to read nature and to understand a proper sense of natural theology. He suggested, he wrote a book particularly called Theological Science. He wrote whole streams of books. But the main book for which I think one of the things he won the Templeton Prize in Science and Religion for was his book Theological Science. Now at the heart of that was a very simple kind of statement. He said to be rational is to be conditioned by the nature of the object. He believed in rationality, and he meant that proper rationality, proper kind of science, proper kind of objectivity meant that the important thing was not you, but the object. And if you were to approach the object properly, you had to be true to its nature. So he argued that in psychological science, you're approaching the psyche. In physical science, you're approaching either the chemistry or the physics. in theology, you are approaching God, the object. And so the method of study has to be appropriate to the object, theological science. To be rational is to be conditioned, controlled, to frame the way in which you think, the way in which you express, the way in which you interrogate or torture or listen to or learn from the nature of the object. The object is the most important thing, which is why, certainly in the North American scene, Torrance was extremely popular. He wasn't so popular, sadly, in Scotland, but in the North American scene was because he talked a language that was very common, the objective kind of emphasis, the way in which science was looking to be true to the object it was studying, or the objects that were being studied. If you think about what the point of things are, what's the point, what's the focus? The focus of science is that something happens. The focus of science is what is happening, and indeed the aim is to try to tell us how it is happening. As Bob said in his kind introduction, Green College and St Edmunds are linked. We have arrangements. And one of the things that we do in Green College is each year the final year students, all graduates, have to present the fruits of their research to the whole college. And they're supposed to do this. And we did this the very first year. I was there when they had the very first time where they presented the fruits of their research, and it was totally incomprehensible. It was a total disaster. I'm sure that the person who was presenting understood, and I'm sure that his or her supervisor, who had kindly been invited and had come along, understood, but nobody else understood. And we had to work hard at teaching people to communicate. And now we still have this presentation, but we spend literally 2-3 weeks with the individual, helping him or her. How do we communicate in language that not so much the non-scientist, but the non-specialist in an area can understand? Because in the end, it's that ability to communicate which is key. And often the problem is not that something is happening or what is happening, but how it is happening. The how is actually often very difficult to translate. How are genes at work? How is this particular condition leading to certain things? How is it that, I remember a student who was working on prostitution, and how is it that prostitutes indicate to each other that this particular client is a dangerous client? And there's a whole network of ways which do communicate, but how that happens is actually very difficult for those of us who are not part of that world. And even a researcher who was a woman working with women found it very difficult to understand the how. She knew that it was happening, she knew what was happening, but how it was happening was difficult. Theology, of course, is concerned much more with the why, that sense of purpose, that ultimate aim, that ultimate level of explanation. So the questions, the foci of science and religion are often in very different places. But I want to, as I was preparing this, to suggest to you that religion, if we're asking, is religion a blockage, does it block scientific advance? I want to suggest an alternate model for that. It's not so much blocking scientific advance, but it can provide a framework for scientific advance. It can provide a framework because what it can do is it can set kind of limits, It can set up some kinds of rules which make activity possible. And the reason I want to suggest that is because of some of the work of the Human Fertilisation Embryology Authority, some of the work of the UK ZERA, United Kingdom Xenotransplantation Interim Regulatory Authority, and GTAC, the Gene Therapy Advisory Committee, all of which have tried to set frameworks, not to stop research, but to ensure that the research is done in a way which means it's good research, but also which means it's done according to the highest ethical standards. And I want to explore that a little bit further about the way in which religion, in particular ethics, sets limits. And I want to take a particular example, which is that of human experimentation. It's very interesting. Once upon a time, there was a very simple way that we used to control experimentations on patients and on human subjects. would you do this to yourself? Then we discovered that some people will do anything to themselves for the sake of the theory. So we thought that's not a very good thing. So then the second test was, would you do this to members of your family? And we discovered that some scientists would do anything to their family for the sake of it. So that's how research ethics committees, whether it's local research ethics committees or multi-center, MRECs as they call them, or in the United States IRBs, institutional review boards, have been set up in order to control, to set some kind of limits to what science is doing. And it's very interesting. In Oxford we have COREC, the Central Oxford Research Ethics Committee, which meets every month and sometimes has up to 120 applications for research using human subjects. And they range from a graduate student who wants to do something for his or her graduate degree over and against quite senior researchers who want to do this, over and against what we call straw men or straw women who come are paid by drug companies to front up experiments which they have no understanding of, no real relation to, but they have a very good track record in terms of research and are willing to do it. So part of the job of MREC and LREC ethics committees is to look at this work and say, should it be permitted? The first question we ask is very interesting. Is this good science? You see, if it's not good science, we're not interested in it. And indeed, we ought not to be doing research which is not good science. And so, of course, you cannot have a committee of 12 people who are expert in every area. But in a university, and particularly in a large medical school, then you have access to all kinds of expertise. And so it's possible, being appropriate for privacy and confidentiality, to ask whether or not this is indeed good science. And so it's interesting that the ethics committee's first concern is not about ethics, it's concerned about science. Is this good science, and will it actually achieve its aim? Sometimes that can lead to very unfortunate reactions. We had one cardiologist who had a theory, and he'd been practicing for about 28, 30 years, and he wanted to do a test, an experiment, a medical experiment. It was very simple. What he wanted to do was to give people a little heart attack. And by giving them a little heart attack, this meant they had a practice run, so that when they had a big heart attack, because they'd had a practice run, they would do much better. And the committee turned him down. And we have a right of appeal, and he exercised his right of appeal and came. He said, I don't know what's wrong with you people. I've been practicing for 28, 30 years. I'm absolutely convinced this will work. Indeed, I've even got 20 patients who are willing to have this little heart attack. And we did ask him where he got the patients from, and they were all patients of his. Now, I don't know how easily you find it to say no to a senior doctor who's responsible for looking after you. We were a little concerned about coercion, but we were also concerned about whether or not he could guarantee it would only be a little heart attack rather than a major heart attack. So he still wasn't allowed to do it. We didn't think this was good science. Never mind, is it statistically significant? Now, I do not understand statistics. And so I know a man who does. And that's basically what happened. In the committee, we looked round the committee and said, how do we know whether these statistics will be significant? And nobody was very sure. Some thought they might be, others thought they might not be. And so we have now a statistician who sits on the ethics committee in order to tell us not just is this good science, but is it actually good statistics? Are we actually producing results which are reliable? There is a gold standard in the whole world of human experimentation, and that is fully informed, valid consent. Now, whether or not it's ever possible to have fully informed, valid consent is highly debatable. But the aim is to work towards that, to give people the information they need to understand what is going to happen, why it's going to happen, what the results might be. If it works out well, what will happen? If it works out badly, what will happen? To be fully informed. What's the nature of the side effects? In American research, you must give all information. which is rather frightening if you're going in to have a toenail removed. And the consent form says one of the things that's required is you will have an anaesthetic, and this anaesthetic might lead to death. Do you want your toenail removed? This is a kind of a bad moment. It can be overkill. In Britain, if the risk is less than 5%, you don't bother telling people. So there's a different perception of how much information do people need to know. Americans are great with the phrases TMI is one I like. And that's too much information. And if you've ever travelled and got into conversation with people, TMI is something that you will have experienced. What fully informed, valid consent? Valid because, of course, these heart patients were not giving free consent. They were under some kind of obligation to the man who'd helped them, and so that pressure on patients, and it's actually very difficult for patients to say no, which is why we've been hearing much about transplantation and whether or not we should have an opting out rather than an opting in kind of system. And one of the reasons is it's very difficult for patients to say no, especially in a situation where they're anxious, where they're grieving, where they're dependent on the individual. Are they really free? Is it valid consent? But of course, consent, what does consent mean? I'd like to take some blood. If I offer my arm, is that giving consent? Or do I have to sign a form? Do I have to sign it in triplicate? Do I have to sign it in the presence of a witness for the consent to be valid? Working with the BMA, we've said that consent is not about a form, it's about a process. So consent is very important in order to safeguard the well-being of both the patient and of the researcher.
David, can you define BMA? Not everyone.
Oh, sorry, the British Medical Association. In America it would be the American Medical Association. In Serbia it would be the Serbian Medical Association. Almost always in every nation there's some central organisation, thank you, the British Medical Association, which really is a kind of trade union for doctors. But they represent the doctors in all negotiations with the government, and of course they also inform the media. Payment, what is appropriate payment? This can lead to all kinds of difficult questions. I had a doctor friend. The government sets targets. One of the targets they set was that you wanted at least 60% of all women in each area, in each practice, to have a cervical smear. And my friend and his practice, they had reached 56%. So that meant he was going to lose the £10,000 for the practice that he would have had if he could make the 60%. So he asked my advice about how he could make up the difference. I said, well, are there any groups in your practice area which are, you know, large concentrations of women? He said, well, yes. Yes, we have a nunnery. And I said, well, what would happen if all the nuns had this test? Well, we would make 62%, we'd get the money. And the difficulty, of course, that cervical smears are not really for people who are not sexually practicing. And nuns, of course, are not usually sexually practicing. So giving them a test which was unnecessary was highly doubtful. But I did think that if he went to talk to the Mother Superior and they agreed to split the profits, then they might not. So the question then is, what kind of payment is appropriate? Now, in theory, you do not pay people to take part in research, but you do give them expenses. But what are legitimate expenses? In terms of infertility work, if you agree to be a surrogate, carry somebody else's child, your expenses will always come to £10,000. Now, how $10,000, $20,000 becomes the expenses, I'm not quite sure. But what's the difference between an expense over against a payment? We're frightened that people, because they're poor, will be dragged in. What kind of privacy is there? How do we safeguard the information about human subjects? What arrangements have been made for randomization? What arrangements have been made for safeguarding accessibility, particularly in terms of computer files? And what about understanding? We spend much of our time actually looking at the letter, because there's a letter sent to the GP and a letter given to the patient. Now, part of the problem was I had a friend who was an expert in diabetes, and he designed his own form. His own form consisted of 22 pages of foolscap, and he would give this to the patient, and then he said, I'd wait for the glazed look in their eye and say, just sign it. Now that, of course, wasn't proper kind of public understanding. So what kind of information, and now the LRECs and the MRECs are asking that the patient letter, the doctor letter, are written in language that the ordinary layperson can understand, so they know exactly what they're agreeing to and what the significance of that might be for them as well as for others. What kind of adverse reaction is there going to be? Well, we know that in Iraq and in Afghanistan, friendly fire is one kind of adverse reaction. How do you report adverse reactions, and what do we do with that information if a human subject has been harmed as a result of that? I think of the way in which the cyclotron unit worked. Up in Edinburgh, they developed a unit, and they were treating people for cancer, and they had 100% success rate. Nobody ever came back with cancer. And then somebody said, well, what happened to these patients? Well, we don't know what happened, but they never came back with cancer. Somebody said, well, perhaps we should find out what happened to them. Well, what happened was they all died. Unfortunately, what looked like a cure was actually killing people. So what's a legitimate application in order to do that? Now, all of these things are designed not to stop research, but to ensure that research is done not just in a good scientific, a good statistical, but in an ethically sound way, where the population, where society will benefit, where the population and society will be positive and constructive, and where the researchers will themselves be safeguarded and protected. And so that whole system of ethical input is designed not to block scientific advance, but in order to encourage it. Science and religion have been in the news recently in the UK. I always like to come to the UK because I can go into college here or in Oxford and read the free newspapers. And in reading the free newspapers, I've discovered that the Welsh and cows have taken over the world. There's a cow which is part of a Hindu group, the equivalent of a Hindu monastery, I think. And unfortunately, this cow has tuberculosis, and that's highly infectious. And so the Welsh authorities said, you must kill the cow. And the Hindu community said they didn't want the cow to be killed because of their particular religious beliefs. And so they took the authority to court, and the authority has now reversed the decision. The cow is to be allowed to survive. Now, it's a very interesting tension between public health concerns, between animal welfare concerns, and religious belief. There can be conflict, there can be tensions, but how far do we go in science and religion? In the end, I think it comes back to public confidence. Public confidence. Public confidence, I think, is very important in the scientific area. It's important because now much of the funding comes from public funding. In the UK ZERA, the United Kingdom Xenotransplantation Interim Regulatory Authority, xenotransplantation is taking organs from animals, usually pigs, and putting them into human beings. That's the ultimate kind of aim. And I think you'll find in the conference later on, others will talk about the significance of that and what we're doing genetically to modify animals. There has been also talk of genetically modifying human beings so that they become more like animals, though. In some student settings, it's happened already. So how far do we go with that? Well, of course, the public consultation has become very crucial. In America, they have what they call town hall meetings, where they go along to a local community, ask anybody and everybody to come along, and the politician or the president or whoever it happens to be, they engage in an open kind of forum, an open kind of discussion. And indeed, in UK ZERA, we've been looking at the idea of how can we involve the public in understanding what science is doing, in understanding what kind of research this is. Indeed, we were approached by one playwright who had written a play and wanted to take the play around the country. It was about, there was a TV program called The Pig Heart Child, but this was actually an adult. And it was a way again of introducing the public to something which was slightly discomforting and discomfiting, and see whether or not this was something the public responded to positively or not. Public funding of research has meant that public confidence is very important. Public understanding of science is very important. And of course, we've seen that just in the last few days here. Here was a company making a documentary about the Queen. And they showed a picture of the Queen allegedly leaving a photo shoot where she'd been asked to remove her robes and her crown because she looked too formal. And so it looked as if the photographer had asked this, and the Queen in anger had got up and walked out, and you saw this picture of the Queen walking along. Actually, that wasn't what had happened at all. They'd reversed the shots. The Queen was going in to the photo shoot, and then the question was asked, and there'd been a little exchange, but there was no walking out. And so suddenly people are saying, can we trust the media? Of course, it also coincided with a time where phone-in lines, they say, do you want to win a prize for such and such? Phone this number, and you phone this number thinking there is some possibility. Now, I'm sure that Rodney would be able to tell us exactly what the degree of possibility was, but it's quite small. But it's at least a little bit more of a possibility than they've already chosen who the candidate is, and he is a member or a friend of somebody on the production team. And so it's a huge row, not just about the BBC, but about all the media. To what extent are we giving reliable information? Because the public certainly has viewed the BBC as giving an objective account. Now, you just have to watch Sky News, ITV News and BBC News to know that there is no objective account. Or you read The Independent, The Guardian, The Times and The Telegraph. There is no one objective account. But we rely on information, the public relies on information, particularly in terms of understanding science. What kind of ethical standards are there for those who engage in broadcasting, for those who engage in science, for those who engage in the discussion between religion and science? Churchill said it's better to jaw than to war. And indeed, I think my plea today is that when it comes to science and religion, it's what we do with it. It's not there's something about religion inherently, something about science inherently, and somehow we're trying to join it. We are the people who engage in science. We are the people who engage in religion. And we need to be communicating with people in the whole realm of religion and the whole realm of communication. In Green College, it's mostly medical, and as mostly medical, we wanted people who had 4-star days at A-levels. Now that's like having a 4.0 or a 4+ grade average if you're in the American system, the very highest kind of national qualifications. People who were great scientists, and we bring them into Green College and into the medical school, and they would have medical sciences, and they would spend 6 years doing medical sciences. And at the end of the 6 years, they were sent out in the world, and they met things called patients. And this was a nasty shock to our people, because the trouble with patients was, first of all, the patient wanted the doctor to explain things in language that patients understood. Now, our people could give a scientific understanding, scientific explanation, but unfortunately most patients couldn't understand that. But it was even worse, because most of the patients wanted the doctor to listen. Now, our medical students had been taught to tell people what to do, but suddenly they discovered that patients wanted to tell the doctor something, and the doctor to take that seriously in the way that the doctor treated him or her. And so we realized we were producing the wrong kind of doctor. And so now we've changed the selection criteria. We've changed the nature of the medical curriculum. Now we're looking for people, yes, who are good scientists. Of course they have to be good scientists. But also they're people who are interested in other people. We teach communication skills, we teach listening skills, we teach ethics, we teach law, we even teach medical humanities to try to produce better rounded doctors. Because what we're trying to grow is virtuous people. What fascinates me is that I'm part of a group in the UK which is actually about bioscientists. The bioscientists are very fearful that some of the work they're doing needs very sensitive decision-making, ethical decision-making. And so we've been drafting ethics for bioscientists. I had this morning an email from an investment bank asking me to help them draft the ethics of investment banking. This is the nice thing about being, well, that's the question. It's the nice thing about being in the area of ethics, you know. I'm going to have a job for the rest of my life because everybody wants the ethics of kind of stuff. It's about growing virtuous people, people who embody the kind of values, the kinds of standards that are crucial. And one of the things that religion can provide, doesn't always provide, but can provide, is a very solid ethical kind of base. But of course, if we're going to have a rapprochement between religion and science, well, we have to have some way of understanding. I had a lovely conversation at lunchtime today, and we were talking about the terror that hits the population if they think they're a band of medical killers on the loose. Because of course our understanding of doctors is that they are there to preserve human life. And that's what was so disconcerting about what happened in Glasgow and the bombs in London. Whether or not there were more than one doctor who actually had another agenda, and whether or not that agenda was putting at risk society. In the realm of education, we need to grow virtuous people. And how do we do that? Well, of course, I want to suggest that religion and religious traditions do that and do that well. It's interesting, the government, when it was concerned about how do we grow good citizens, how do we grow a more polite society, is looking to religious groups and to the churches in order to provide input both about what should be taught and how it should be taught. I think in terms of the debate between science and religion, how we use our religion, how we use our science, how we communicate with each other, and how we try to grow a generation of scientists in particular whose values are strong, who will not only do good science, not only have solid, good levels of statistics, but actually in the work in which, the way in which they do the work, the way in which they conduct the research, the way in which they use the results and apply the results will actually be for the benefit. Does religion block the advance of science? No, I believe it can create a framework in which the practice of science actually goes forward rather than backwards. I was given an hour and it's exactly 3 o'clock. So
Thank you as ever, David. We're leaving us plenty of time for questions too, of which I'm sure there will be many. Who would like to kick off? Let's go to Jez.
Yeah, there were some absolutely fantastic kind of ethical and moral considerations there for kind of preliminary stuff before you get into labs, and that was absolutely brilliant. Now, I actually try and avoid labs as much as possible. When I'm in them, I'm doing physics work. Now, I'm absolutely convinced that electrons don't have feelings, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any ethical considerations in physics. I mean, after all, physics gave us the atomic bomb. It gets that major. How, in a subject where you don't have the ability to have a kind of pre-lab ethical talk, do you still make sure that you have proper ethical and moral considerations in the work you're doing?
Every organisation, every lab, every institute has some kind of ethos. I've done a little bit of work with industry, and it's interesting, different companies, each of them have their own kind of internal style, internal ambience. And if you want to make a difference ethically, you have to make sure, I think you have to make sure it's top down. I don't think it works bottom up, especially not in industry. And I'm pretty sure that the same is true in hospital settings and in laboratory settings. It's top down. So you need to convince those who run the lab, those who do the work, of the importance. So that's one level. How do you set the context? How do you express that? How do you induct people into the context? How do they know how to behave in that? I was teaching the other day a student from Jesus College in Oxford, and he said, you know, Oxford is just the same. You know, it's all the same here. And I said, which college are you part of? He said, Jesus College. And I said, what college am I part of? He said, Green College. I said, do you think what you do in Jesus you can do in Green? What we do in Green you do in Jesus? Oh, no, that's different. Well, it's different because there are different cultures, different contexts, different styles, different governments, governance, different ways of being, different sets of customs and habits. So I think we need to be clear about the context, who sets the context, and how can ethics be part of that. I have a friend who's an Old Testament scholar, and he, like Dennis, had been over lecturing in the United States. Now, the trouble with being a lecturer in another country is you run out of lectures to give, and he ran out of lectures to give. And so he went to the library, and he thought, I'll look at some of the journals here. So he found a journal that he'd never seen before. He thought, this is my area. So he picked up the journal, he looked through, and he said, oh, this is a topic that I know something about. And so he began to read this, and he thought, this is familiar. Read a little bit more, and he said, this is very familiar. Indeed, I wrote this. And it was so-and-so from some state university. So he phoned up this person, and he was not very happy that his article had reappeared in this magazine. And the gentleman said, oh, you should be flattered. I was coming up for tenure, and I needed one more academic piece. And I hadn't got time to write something. And I found your article in an obscure journal. And so, I added a couple of things and put it in, and it's published now. So your article's got all kind of, well, one of the tests in the scientific community or in any academic community is peer review. We take truth-telling, we take repeatability very, very seriously. See, there are ethical standards built into the practice of science at the very basic level of how do I know that my results are reliable? Can indeed they be repeated? Is this really an accurate account? Which is why what happened in South Korea in relation to the cloning was regarded so seriously, not just by the rest of the world and the non-scientific world, but the scientific world, because it then undermined the confidence the public had. Actually, these people know what they're doing, and they're doing it in a proper, appropriate kind of way. So I think that to some extent, the whole enterprise of science needs to draw out the values which are implicit. And so one, look at the context and work in the context top down, but also look at the values which are implicit in doing laboratory scientific work at all.
But can I, at the risk of taking the floor, as an example of a bottom-up example of ethics in a laboratory? I gave a talk last week on the environment and global climate change. And afterwards, an engineering student came up to me and said, I'm doing flow in pushing stuff through a flow channel, to see pushing air and stuff, and I put a tracer in it to see how the flow goes as it goes over some aerofoil or something. And I realised that the other day, this student said that the particular chemical I'm using has a greenhouse warming potential. It has a virulence of causing greenhouse warming, which is 22,000 times worse than carbon dioxide. It's a particularly nasty chemical. And he said, so I've stopped using it, and I'm looking for alternatives. This one worked really well because you could trace it in some way, but I'm looking for some alternative way. And it seems to me there's an example of an individual that we have instilled this virtuous practice in, that actually is seeing something that is being done in the lab, completely in a different context, as having an ethical dimension to it.
Right, and that's wonderful, and I'm sure that can be done. I think the difficulty is that for many people who are employed, particularly at a junior level, it takes a great deal of courage in order to say this is economically not the best, but morally, environmentally, this is actually something which is good. So yes, of course we want to encourage that, which is why in many firms they will have suggestion boxes, so that people are able to make the suggestion without necessarily suffering as a result of that, but still the point is made. And I think that's one way of trying to protect the individual. But of course it's wonderful when individuals do that, but I think we mustn't expect or put all our confidence just in the individual and his or her bravery to step up and take part in that, which is why I think by and large, top down, if you can convince the senior people that there is something here. I'm interested in grocery chains, because grocery chains about 15 years ago approached people like myself saying, we think that tomorrow's thing is going to be ethics, and that we want our customers to believe that we are an ethical company. so why don't you come along and join our board, and you will get, cheap groceries and all that if you join. And it was very interesting because there the senior management had realized that there was a trend in society where people wanted confidence. They wanted confidence that grocery chains were behaving in appropriate kinds of ways. And fair trade. I'm amazed to go into how many grocery stores in the UK and find the fair trade whereby the producer is actually receiving the money rather than the middle man or woman. And that's again from the top down. And so the more that we can encourage that, I want to go with that. I don't want to say no to the other.
Yes, no, it's interesting there's those two modalities,
Right.
but I'm sure you're right about the overarching structure that allows that to happen.
As you just mentioned, we believe that truth is from God. But in a pluralist society like in Europe, in England, God has different definition. When you work in a community, there are some Muslims, there are some Hindus. People are there, Veda or the Quran. How do you come up with the common ground and the common standard of ethics?
Yes, I think in two different kinds of ways. First of all, I think at the theoretical level, people used to ask C.S. Lewis, why are there so many good people outside the church? And he said, well, because they're made in the image of their Heavenly Father. And he believed that because human beings were made by God, that they had some kind of moral sense, moral consciousness, moral awareness, which was universal. And we saw yesterday some references to some of the content of that. So I think you're looking at the theoretical level. At the practical scientific research level, you're trying to put some flesh on that. What is the common ground that we can agree with? And it's interesting, I found that in pluralist societies, working with people who are religiously totally opposed to who I am, what I stand for, what I believe, nevertheless, they are also deeply, deeply concerned about things like the environment, about things like peer group review and honesty in science. They're concerned about the impact, particularly on children. I've yet to find people who say, oh, let's go out and have a little bit of child abuse. Oh, wouldn't that be fun? That's just not something that we find across the board. So I want to explore empirically what are the kinds of values, what are the kinds of practices that we can affirm together. And I'm surprised how many there are. And so I think we look for those and we build on the common ground.
I want to first say I'm very much inclined to agree with your view that you presented here. But I have questions that I want.
Notice the but there.
Yeah. But yes, it's always no because. But actually, no. Actually, it is quite a real question here because you use the word rules make activity possible. And then I have the question: do you that mean when you use the word possible? Do you only use it in a sort of moral sense? It makes moral things possible, because you could of course argue in the sense that although it was deeply perverted, what Mengele did in the camps was science, and that what Werner von Braun was doing, building the V2 and the V1s, was science, and the euthanasia programs they used was science. So when you use the word possible, do you say the moral restrictions we absolutely, because that's, I think, and I agree with you there, that's the most important way religion and science interact on the moral level. But do you also need the moral rules to make the science itself scientifically work?
Yes, what led me to make this statement possible and not to define it purely as moral was looking at particularly Wittgenstein and the notion of a game. And the games have to have rules, otherwise they're not. I have a 6-year-old grandson, and I've been teaching him a variation on chess, whereby you can always win. Now, this is something which appeals to the 6-year-old as much as it appeals to the 60-year-old. I can win all the time. And so I'm trying to teach him the rules, how you can play this game according to the rules, and if you do it properly, you will always win, because that's the way the game is designed. Now, it's possible we could play a different game, we could do another kind of activity, but if we're going to do this activity, and if he wants to do it well, that's where the second level, the evaluative, the value kind of level, So I want to suggest both, that we need some kind of framework. So which framework are we going to use in order to do any particular science or any particular scientific experiment? But also, if we want to do it well, what is good science? And by good science, I mean, is it scientifically provable, testable? Is it statistically significant? And will it satisfy the ethical criteria which we as a community share? Now, I happen to have religious perspectives. I live in a pluralist society, as we've just been alluding to, which doesn't always share all of my values. But what is surprising is how many of the values they want. They want to have the values. They don't want the superstructure, the infrastructure, but they do want the values. Which is why so many people send their children to religious schools, even though they themselves are not religious, because they want their children to grow up with a strong sense of morality. Where am I going to get the strong sense of morality? They think from religious schools. So they're choosing to send their children there. And so there's something very deep in human understanding which seems to indicate that it's a level of, can we conduct this at all? And if we're going to conduct it, how do we conduct it well rather than badly? And by well, it's not just scientifically well, but also morally well.
Can I just press you, just to pick up something that was asked? Should we therefore use results from Dr. Mengele's experiments, which were in concentration camps and very horrible, or should we say they were so abhorrent that we shouldn't even look at the data from them?
Yes, it's difficult because once the result is in the public arena, the result is there. Yes, the result was obtained by means that we would not want to repeat, and we ought not to repeat. But whether or not as a result we say, this is something, it's like money. I remember being approached by the Council of Church, the British Council of Churches, where the government wanted them to celebrate some particular event. And they were going to use lottery money to do this. And they said, well, can we use lottery money to do this? And I said, well, yes, if this is a state occasion. And it's clear, this is a state occasion, this is a government requested, this is a government funded, where the government got its money from is up to the government. But we are providing that service on their terms. Whereas the church ought to do an alternative, which they themselves funded with money that they're comfortable with in that kind of way. So I think that would be my general response.
Very carefully nuanced.
In your interactions with various corporations and this idea of using rules, hopefully moral rules, to create a healthy society, do you feel on average that the corporations see these moral guidelines as something that would inhibit profit or actually in the long term promote it?
Well, it's interesting, if you take investment, we talked about the investment people, more and more companies are saying these are ethical investments. Now, this is not religious groups saying you should have ethical investments. These are financial companies saying, what is it we want to do, and how can we do this in a way which will encourage people to buy our particular product? And the answer is ethical investments. Now, this is not easy. Dennis made reference to this room and the fellowship meeting. Well, we did a fellowship meeting in Green College, and Green College was very opposed to smoking, and they were also very uneasy about defence. And so they said, we will not put any investments in any bank which is dealing with either smoking or with defence. And we couldn't find a single bank that had no link at all. Now, the links often were far removed, but the question is, where can we find this absolute purity? And it wasn't possible in the market, but it was possible to find people who had more or less, who were trying, or those who were not trying. And I think that companies are looking, because I think they believe that in the long term it will be financially to their advantage, and the alternative, being seen as unethical investing, is actually very difficult. In working with medical professional groups, transplant surgeons or geneticists or whatever, I've often said to them, if you do not make up your rules, the government will make up its rules. And the government rules will be much harder and much more unpleasant than the kind of rules that you make. So you set your own house in order and do it in a way which will show the public that they can have confidence in how you are behaving, and then the government will not intervene and force you to act in particular ways, because morality and legality are not the same kinds of things.
Yes, while I'm just waiting for another question, just read recently about an unethical investment fund which invested in weapons and exports to dubious nations and that sort of thing, all the horrible things. But the return on it is like double anything else.
Right, and so is the risk. So it's the risk, you know.
The risk is probably too, yes.
That's right, and so
that's how you justify it.
Well, I think that, you know, to a bank or an investment company, they're saying, how can we minimize risk but maximize profit? And so, yes, there's a tension between the two, but the high-risk strategy is very dangerous.
Yes. Any more questions or comments from people? Yes, Patrick.
It did cross my mind that you haven't really addressed what many atheists would see as the sort of restrictions that religious faith is placing on the public square through, for example, objections to stem cell research or attempts to get intelligent design on the curriculum in the States and things like that, where the actual content of religious beliefs seems to be dictating moral standards that aren't defensible on purely secular premises, but nonetheless, because there's such political organisation in the States, for example, that they start affecting what the government spends its money on, and in that way, religion nonetheless constricts what people are able to do, and it really does prevent scientific progress in certain areas.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is legitimate. It will be even more legitimate if by tomorrow at 5 o'clock you haven't heard me address particularly the area of embryonic research, because I think that's the one I do look at tomorrow. But as far as the question about curriculum, it seems to me that if you live in a democracy, then every voice has the right to be heard and the freedom to be heard. And so what we have to do is to express ourselves in a way which will convince those who do not share our belief system. Now that's the challenge. And I think that, yes, I can get a group of fundamentalists together and I can say, let's have X on the curriculum. But I've got to convince the school board. Now what actually happens in the States is they don't do that. What happens is they hive off, they create the ghetto, and in the ghetto they teach in a very particular kind of way, using particular kind of material. I'm not greatly interested in the ghetto. I'm interested in the mainstream, and I want the Christian voice, or any religious voice, to be heard in the marketplace. And that means we've got to find some kind of argumentation which will convince those who do not share our beliefs, but will recognize the benefit. Talking theologically, I believe that God's law, God's standards are good. That's the definition of goodness. But also they're not just good in themselves, they're good for us. And if I believe they're good for us, I can show there is some kind of benefit. Which was why this morning when Dennis was presenting David Myers, who's a psychologist from Hope College, he's presenting, actually, if you are religious, actually, if you attend church more than once a week, then you will find there are these particular kinds of benefits. Now that should not surprise us. It shouldn't surprise us because this is good in and of itself, but it's also good for people. And I think it's that good for people which we have to show. There are lots of areas where, in terms of curriculum, my experience of government, to be honest, is the other way around. It's the government which wants you to help them get morality or get some things into the curriculum, rather than you trying to persuade government to do it. That's in the UK scene. In the US scene, it's very difficult. It's very different because, of course, school boards there are much more about localities, and people are elected to the school board. So if you can get enough people to elect you, then you will be able to write your particular curriculum. And so that's an expression of that local community. Because every community in the US does what's right in its own eyes, then there isn't one national standard that they all uphold. You know, teaching in Illinois is very different from teaching in Indiana. they have different kind of criteria. So I can go into a school in Indiana, a grade school, primary school, and all the children will be on a particular page at a certain grade level at a certain age. That's very much a controlled thing. So of course, making a difference to the state educational framework would be a different. You've got to do it in a democratic way. And that's not easy to do, given, as we had this morning, the division between the Republicans and the Democrats and everything in between. There's a tremendous concern. And more people are homeschooling. I mean, that's what's happening. People are removing from the mainstream because they don't like what the mainstream curriculum is doing, and they want to control their own curriculum.
Should we just take one last question, then we'll Joseph, then we'll start.
Yeah, we've done a lot on ethics. Wondering about the religious fear again. I mean, when the Catholic Church tried to stop Galileo, it wasn't because of ethical considerations, it's because they were genuinely afraid of his conclusions. Do you think that religious fear still blocks scientific advance today? And how do we get from that to your idea of all truth being God's truth?
This is a lovely question to ask a philosopher, because most philosophy students come and are terrified. They're terrified not because they themselves are terrified, but because all their friends and their relatives are saying, you mustn't study philosophy. Philosophy will destroy your faith. Therefore, don't do philosophy. I've been teaching for 35 years, and I can only think of one student who lost his faith. And his loss of faith was nothing to do with philosophy, but it had lots to do with personality and home circumstances and so on. So I'm a little concerned that I'm sure there is fear. But I think we have to ask what's the root of the fear. And I think that betokens those who run churches or synagogues or mosques. We need to be encouraging people in those positions of authority when they present science to do it in a constructive way rather than a destructive way. When they present the fruits, when they make comments on, because that's how people are informed. Likewise with newspapers, looking at the way the newspapers report scientific advance, what they're interested in, what kind of, the television programs, as Dennis was saying this morning, in relation to the Dawkins kind of program, the editor carries tremendous power, and he or she can change the nuance of a program simply by the way they present who you are, by the kind of label they put underneath, by the kind of framing. If I take part in a philosophy program, I'm always with a book in my hand and lots of books behind me. If it's a religious program, it's a stained glass window behind me. And this sends out a message, chaplain, Green College, Oxford, or philosopher, whatever it happens to be, or professor, or just Oxford, the labeling. And so presentation is crucial, and I think religious leaders have a responsibility in the way that they talk about science. And sadly, they're the people who are often most fearful.